for us today and their continued service to our nation. It's been 1 year. It's been 1 year since President Obama spoke to the nation about the threat posed by ISIL and increased U.S. military operations against us. Many of us believe that the goal the President laid out, quote, to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL, is right. Many of us agree with a military strategy that seeks to empower local forces in Iraq and Syria to combat ISIL, with U.S. and coalition training, equipment, assistance, and air power. 1 year into this campaign, it seems impossible to assert that ISIL is losing and that we are winning. And if you're not winning in this kind of warfare, you are losing. Stalemate is not success. It is accurate that we have conducted thousands of airstrikes against ISIL, trucks and fighters, bunkers and buildings. This conjures the illusion of progress, but what effect has that had? ISIL has lost some territory on the margin, mainly to Kurdish and Shiite forces, but ISIL has consolidated control of its core territories and expanded its control in Syria. It continues to dominate Sunni Arab areas in both Iraq and Syria. It maintains control of key cities like Mosul, Fallujah, and Ramadi, and efforts to retake those territories appear to have stalled entirely. Meanwhile, ISIL is expanding globally. It's now operating in Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, and Egypt, and other radical Islamic groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria and al-Shabaab in Somalia have pledged allegiance to ISIL. This appearance of success only enhances ISIL's ability to radicalize, recruit, and grow. Published media reports suggest that the CIA's estimates of ISIL's manpower has remained constant, despite U.S. airstrikes, which suggests that either they were wrong to begin with or that ISIL is replacing its losses in real time. Neither is good. Indeed, this committee is disturbed by recent whistleblower allegations that officials at Central Command skewed intelligence assessments to paint an overly positive picture of conditions on the ground. We are currently investigating these allegations, which we take with the utmost seriousness. The Department of Defense should as well. And if true, those responsible must be held accountable. Ultimately, it's not that we are doing nothing to counter ISIL. It is that there is no compelling reason to believe that anything we are currently doing will be sufficient to achieve our strategic objective of degrading and ultimately destroying ISIL. The United States and our partners do not have the initiative. Our enemies do. They're capitalizing on our inadequate policy to maintain and enhance their initiative as they have for the past 4 years. Indeed, the situation on the ground is now taking yet another dramatic turn for the worse, as several recent events make clear. Recent published reports state that U.S. officials believe that ISIL is using mustard gas and may even be manufacturing these chemical weapons by themselves. Whether ISIL is manufacturing chemical weapons themselves or acquired from former or current stocks maintained by Bashar Assad, this is a potential nightmare scenario for our partners in the Middle East and for us. At the same time, the United States' effort to train and equip Syrian rebels to fight ISIL is clearly and unfortunately failing. The goal was 3,000 fighters in the first year. Instead, this program has trained and equipped only 54 fighters, some of whom were killed or captured by al-Qaeda as soon as they returned to Syria. This program, the administration promised, would result in a viable indigenous ground force in Syria, has yet to produce any significant effects on the battlefield. To be sure, fixation with perfect vetting, both in the Congress and the administration, is contributing to this failure. But far worse has been the administration's requirement that this new Syrian force could only fight ISIL, not the Assad regime, which has killed far more Syrians than ISIL, and the President's refusal until just weeks ago to authorize the close air support and other military assistance to ensure our Syrian partners would be successful. Unfortunately, these contradictions were clear from the beginning, and many members of this committee warned the administration to change course. Their failure to do so has squandered a lot of time, money, and worst of all, credibility. For this committee to continue supporting this program, we need some major changes. Into this vacuum has now stepped Vladimir Putin. As in Ukraine and elsewhere, he perceives the administration's inaction and caution as weakness and he is taking advantage. According to media reports, Putin has deployed strike aircraft, T-90 tanks, howitzers, armored personnel carriers, Russian Marines, and housing for up to 1,500 personnel in military bases in western Syria. This is an expansion of Russian power in the Middle East that we have not seen in 4 decades. And it will allow Putin to further prop up Assad, fuel his indiscriminate killing machine, play kingmaker in any transition, undermine U.S. goals, policy, and operations, and ultimately prolong this horrific conflict. The main beneficiary will be ISIL. Many of us have said from the beginning that the conflict in Syria would not be contained, and for 4 years we have seen evidence of that, the hundreds of thousands dead, the millions of driven and displaced people, the use of chemical weapons, and the rise of the worst terrorist army in the world. Now we are seeing the latest manifestation of this failed policy, the flood of people pouring out of the Middle East that has led to the worst refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The administration has promised to accept 10,000 refugees in the coming year. That's a noble gesture. But unless we address the cause of this crisis, which is the continued grinding conflict in Syria, the refugees will keep coming. ISIL will grow stronger, the Middle East will descend further into chaos, and U.S. national security interests will be put at greater risk. For 4 years, we have been told that there is no military solution to this conflict, as if anyone believes there is. And there are no good options, as if anybody believes there are. That our influence is limited, as if that has not always been the case. That we will not succeed overnight, as if our problem is one of time, not policy. And that we cannot solve every problem in the Middle East, as if that absolves us of our responsibility to make the situation better where we can. This is not a question of our capacity or our capabilities or our options. We have options between doing nothing and invading Iraq and Syria. Many members of this committee have suggested such options for years now, and they are still relevant. We need to put an end to Assad's ability to use air power against his people, especially the use of horrific barrel bombs. Shoot down planes that drop barrel bombs that slaughter innocent civilians. It's one of the leading killers of innocent civilians. We need to help establish safe zones inside Syria where refugees and displaced people can be secure. We need forward air controllers to add precision and lethality to our air campaign. We need to make significant changes in order to improve and rapidly expand our training of Syrian and Iraqi forces. And while no one believes that we need to invade Iraq or Syria, the fact is that we will likely need additional U.S. Special Forces and military advisors to be successful. I hope our witnesses will not repeat our desired policy goals and a list of tactical achievements and talk about, quote, 9 lines of effort. We have heard all of that before, but we have yet to hear a theory of victory. I hope to hear one today. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Wormuth, and General Austin, welcome. This morning's hearing continues the committee's review of U.S. military operations to counter ISIL in Iraq and Syria and its growth in the broader Middle East, Africa, and South Asia through its extreme ideological and brutal tactics, including the reported development and use of chemical weapons. ISIL has gained control over portions of Syria and Iraq, effectively erasing the border between these countries. This violent extremist group has slaughtered civilians, enslaved women and girls, and carried out horrific attacks against ethnic and religious minorities, and broadcast its barbaric acts on social media. To escape the violence of ISIL, the Assad regime, and multiple other armed elements, millions have been displaced or fled outside Iraq and Syria. The crush of fleeing refugees into Europe has only added to the sense of urgency regarding the need to restore security in the region. The military campaign against ISIL remains complex with no easy answers. While the coalition has had success in pushing ISIL out of some territory, including gains by the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north, the retaking of Tikrit by Iraqi security forces, and the Syrian Kurds' removal of ISIL along sections of the border with Turkey, the self-described Islamic State continues to hold key cities, including al-Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq. The Iraq Security Forces' counteroffensive to take back Ramadi has struggled over the last few months, and Baji remains contested. At the same time, Iranian-backed Shia militias have stalled in their operations near Fallujah. And despite its recent setbacks, ISIL is consolidating its control over local populations in the areas that it holds in both Syria and Iraq. The recent agreement between the United States and Turkey, expanding access to land and use of Turkish air bases and seeking to create an ISIL-free zone on the Syrian side of the border, is an important step forward. However, the provocative deployments by Russia of additional military forces to bases in Syria under the guise of assisting in countering ISIL efforts appears to be an effort by Putin to prop up the Assad regime, further complicating efforts to restore security in Syria. These events have raised concerns over whether the current level of our efforts against ISIL is sufficient. A critical issue for the military lines of effort within the counter-ISIL strategy is the progress of the U.S. train and equip programs for coalition-backed forces in both Iraq and Syria. While the U.S.-led air campaign has had an effect in degrading ISIL, effective local forces that can take full advantage of coalition air power, seize ground from ISIL, and then hold it are essential to success. In Iraq, operations to take Anbar require recruiting significant numbers of Sunnis into the Iraqi security forces and equipping them to resist the ISIL threat. I am concerned by reports that Sunni recruitment has fallen short of its targets and that the government of Iraq has been slow in delivering equipment for arming Sunni forces. In Syria, the DoD Syria Train and Equip program, according to public reports, has experienced a variety of setbacks. We'll be interested in your assessment of this effort, quite interested. In general, I also hope you will address what you believe might be done to intensify military operations to counter the ISIL threat. For example, would you support a more active role for U.S. military personnel in facilitating the engagement with Sunni tribes, or providing advisors within the Iraqi Ministry of Defense to build institutional capacity, or accompanying Iraqi security forces on a limited basis when direct contact with the enemy is not anticipated? The ISIL problem is not geographically bounded by Syria and Iraq. And indeed, as the Chairman has pointed out, ISIL-inspired or directed groups have appeared in Yemen, Afghanistan, Egypt, Libya, Nigeria, the Horn of Africa, and the Caucasus, and elsewhere. General, I am interested in your assessment of the group's growth in the region and how CENTCOM is contributing to trans-regional efforts to combat the group. Ultimately, the success of the counter-ISIL effort will depend on a number of non-military factors also, including whether the reforms Prime Minister Abadi has initiated are implemented and result in an Iraqi government that is more inclusive and responsive to the concerns of the Sunnis, Kurds, religious minorities, and other factions in Iraq society. Whether the international coalition, including states in the region, can effectively counter ISIL's propaganda, financing, and the spread of its extreme ideology, and whether a political solution can be found for the crisis in Syria. These issues are the primary responsibility of departments other than the Department of Defense, but I assume our witnesses would agree that these issues are integral to our comprehensive approach to countering the ISIL threat. General Austin, I hope that you will also, to the extent possible, given the ongoing review by the Inspector General, address questions involving intelligence assessments with respect to ISIL. It is important that we wait for the Inspector General's investigation before completed, before making a judgment, but I have no doubt you will take such allegations as seriously as we do in Congress, and we take them very seriously. Like Senator McCain, I expect the committee will be kept apprised of this investigation as it continues and be active in terms of the recommendations. Let me thank both witnesses for the testimony this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Wormuth.
Thank you, Chairman McCain and Ranking Member Reed, as well as members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to give you an update on the military aspects of our counter-ISIL campaign. It's also a pleasure, as always, to be here with General Austin. We work very closely together every day on a range of issues, so it's nice to be here with him today. As the chairman said, it's been just over a year since the United States and a coalition of nations began the military campaign against ISIL. When we began that campaign about a year ago, ISIL was pushing into Kurdish territory in northern Iraq